and welcome to the Brazilian BA guest. And today we are going to answer a question that's very common for a lot of our business analysts. How do I ensure that a story is ready for development and does not have outstanding dependencies and impediments? And today I'm so honored to have a guest that's an author of a really good books I do have here, and probably some of you have them also. That's Howard Podesva. Hi, Howard. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Fabrizio. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. And Howard, how do I ensure that a story is ready for development? I mean, it does not have outstanding dependencies or impediments. How can I do that?
Okay, so this is a really good question. It's the kind of question I've been asked a lot of times from teams. I could just give one example of a manager asking me it in this way. She said, I've got all these stories. They obviously haven't been prepared properly. In her case, she had a number of stories that all were part of an end-to-end business process. Right? So if it's lab testing, you can imagine that a story might be let's take the whole COVID situation. So somebody books an appointment for a vaccine. So that's one story. The next story in line for this whole process is the person now arrives, at the hospital or at the center to get their shot, and then they should appear there, right, when the nurse or whoever is, or the caregiver accepts them, and that has to run smoothly. And then they have to be able to that person then, when the shot is administered, has to be able to log whatever information is necessary about that shot and possibly even book the next appointment and so on. So how do you
generate a certificate, something like that? There's a lot of stories, but if you look from an outside view, it's a single story, right?
That's right. If you think about the value stream, it's one value stream. It starts with, a patient or a citizen, human being who needs a test, and it ends up, or who needs the vaccines, and who ends up getting the vaccine. So for them, this story is not finished until they're fully vaccinated. Unfortunately, when you look at it as a user story at a time, you don't see that connection. And so when I first heard this complaint, this manager complaining about what was going on in her teams, I said, well, why don't, obviously, nobody has done the preparation beforehand to look at how all the stories connect together into this end-to-end value stream. And I said, why hasn't that happened? And she gave me a few reasons. She said, well, one reason is each team is working on its own piece of that feature, right? So one team might be focused on things that face the patient. So when the patient actually goes onto a website and books the vaccination initially. Another team might be focused on the nurse, or the person who administers the procedure, and so on down the line. There is no team that's actually looking at the whole thing. And because nobody's looking at the whole thing, nobody ends up doing it. And every team thinks somebody else must be doing it.
Usually there are different channels where people are, like the nurse is acting in a system, and the people who is taking the vaccine is acting in another system.
Right.
So teams are splitted not by the value chain, but they are splitted by systems.
That's right. That's right. Stuff like that. Yes. So that nobody's actually seeing the whole picture. And so, either nobody thinks about doing it at all, or everybody assumes somebody else has probably already done it, or nobody wants to volunteer to do it because that's going to take time from their team, right, to do the stuff that's actually been assigned to them specifically. So this is what she told me. So I'm stuck now because I can't get my teams to do it. On top of that, she said, even if I could, get around some of those problems, many of my teams don't even think that this preparation is even necessary because they're an agile team, and they've been told by some consultants that you don't do, deep analysis beforehand. You just take them a story at a time. So the question is, what are the answers? I can give you maybe like 3 or 4 different techniques that together solve this problem.
Great.
Let's just to summarize, we can look at feature previews, the definition of ready, the practice of ATDD, acceptance test driven development, and if I'd added yet another one, it would probably be the use of spikes. So should we dig in?
At least a little bit of each one.
Okay, so we'll give you a few minutes on each just to whet people's appetite. The first thing that was missing to me in this for this organization and for anybody else, often for other organizations that have this problem, is the use of the feature preview meeting. It has that name under SAFE if you're using the SAFE methodology. Mike Cohen refers to it as a rolling look-ahead meeting. So you can see that many people use this idea. And it's a very, very simple little fix to the problem. It's very simply that after every sprint planning meeting, so this is something you do about every 2 weeks, right? Just after that meeting, you have a 10-minute meeting. And the purpose of this 10-minute meeting, which is the feature preview, is simply to look ahead. It's approximately 2 sprints ahead to see what stories are coming down the pipeline. And just to do a quick survey of those stories to see which of these stories is not yet ready for development. So that immediately you're going to be flagging and targeting those which are not fully enough understood. For example, like we don't understand the connection between this story to make the vaccine appointment and this story to administer the vaccine. So it gives us a chance to flag that. And why do we do it 2 whole sprints ahead? Because if we find a dependency between a story that our team is going to do, let's say we're in sprint number 1 and we're going to do it in sprint number 3, and we have a dependency on team B, it's too late for team B to put it in there in sprint number 1 because they've already planned that sprint. So they're going to put it into maybe sprint number 2. And by the time they're finished, it will be sprint number 3, which is when we can actually start doing our story. So that's why we would say in general about 2 sprints ahead. So that's one fix. The next fix we look at is the spike. Many people don't do analysis work because they have no way to account for it. They've been told that every single story has to produce something of value, right, that you can deliver.
An increment in the product, right?
Exactly, yeah. And if this story is not giving you incremental value, then it's not really a valid story. That's the way people are operating. And there is some truth to that about user stories. And so they simply just don't have a mechanism for dealing with analysis work when it's just analysis work alone. So the trick to that is just to use something called a spike or a functional spike. And what is a spike? A spike is a special kind of a story that doesn't necessarily produce workable code at the end of it. It produces understanding. That we understand things well enough that we will be able to do another story in the future. So if we identify during the feature preview that some analysis work is done, the way that we can account for it is by creating a spike for it. Special kind of a story. I like to there's argument about whether or not they should be estimated. I think they should be estimated. So that when you're planning a sprint, if it's going to take X number of points or hours to do this analysis, you've accounted for it as well. Assuming that the analyst is part of your team.
You should at least compromise some amount of effort, right?
Yes, that's right. And so you have to account for that effort if it's going to take up some of your team's capacity.
All right.
So that's the spike. The next thing I want to talk about is the definition of ready, which is a key component in all of this. All these ideas fit together. When I said that during the feature preview, you're examining the story to see whether or not it's actually ready, it's ready to go. What do you mean by ready to go? So most people understand the idea of a definition of done. They understand it because it's right in the Scrum Guide. So it's become a very common thing. A definition of done basically is a series of conditions that must be fulfilled before a story is considered to be complete enough to be deliverable. What many people don't know is that there's also a really good tool that's very similar at the front end, and that's a definition of ready. And definition of ready means it's just basically a list of conditions that should be satisfied before a story is slotted into development. So before it's put into the sprint plan, if you're using Scrum, or if you're using Kanban, that's before that unit gets thrown into the development phase. So what are some of these things that we would look at for the definition of ready? First of all, I should say that every team should come up with its own definition and adjust the definition based on their experience of what works. But I just give out some, in my book, I actually have lists of conditions that are typical for a definition of ready, but I could just highlight a few of them. The most obvious one is the story must be small. So a story should be implementable within a sprint if you're using Scrum. So within roughly a 2-week period. In terms of points, most people put a cap of 8 points on stories, although they like most of them to be 5 or less, but the odd one might be 8. And why 8? Because if you think of the number of weekdays in a 2-week scrum, that's 10. 2 of them are lost to planning and retrospectives and so on. So if you really want to get something done, it can't really exceed 8 as a very high maximum. But then some people go even lower, and some teams find that things work really well for them if their stories are much, much smaller, more like a day or two's worth of work at a time. The story should be
independent. It assumes that you're using 1 point per day, right? Teams may use different.
Yes, that's right. Now that's roughly with the idea that 1 point is more or less a day, which is more or less true. But as we know, that's a whole other topic. It depends upon the velocity.
Right.
The other thing about story is that the story should be independent, and I shouldn't say, let's say, minimally dependent on other stories. It's very hard to actually get fully independent stories where there's no dependency whatsoever on any other team. But as much as possible, we look for minimal dependencies, because if we can actually define the story in the first place so that I'm not waiting for another team to do some work, this problem won't even occur as much. We also want the story to be actionable, which means that it has no dependencies on other stories, or let's say, as I say, minimal dependencies. But that's part of it. We already covered that with independence, but also any other impediments. The story should be unique. We shouldn't have 2 stories about the same thing in the product backlog. That's obviously, a bad thing. It doesn't make any sense, but it happens just when you have a lot of stories running around. And it should be consistent with other stories that are in the backlog. So there shouldn't be a business rule, let's say, in this story that contradicts a business rule in another story. It should be testable. The story should be discussed recently. So the value of the story wasn't just set maybe months ago and we haven't reconsidered. We should actually reconsider before the sprint to make sure that that value is still true. And the story should be supported by, wireframes and so on. So the story DOR is basically a list of conditions that's basically just there to say, we're going to avoid the problem that we started talking about today by listing things that we want to see in a story, and then during that feature preview, making sure that the story DOR is actually satisfied before we put the story into a sprint. So that's that technique. And then finally, and this is probably the most difficult one to explain, but I can just get into it a little bit, is ATDD, acceptance test driven development.
I believe I will let that for the people to find out when they read your book. Could you tell us a little bit about the book you just released?
Sure. So all of these things I'm talking about now are all amongst the many techniques. There's over 175 different tools and techniques in this book.
175?
Yeah, I actually went through and counted them. We're trying to put actually a spreadsheet together so people can find them all. What the book is that it's a book about the analysis and planning process when you're doing agile software development. It's the only book that I know of, and the reason I wrote it is I saw a lack in the industry of something that would take the reader from the initial vision for a product or a major enhancement to a product all the way through to implementation and continuous value delivery, and see the connection between all of those in an agile world. Agile is very easy to do if you don't consider the planning issues, if you just take stories one at a time. But as we've been talking about here, you see that when you do that, you run into trouble. So it does actually require planning, but how do you do it in a way that's agile, that allows for adaptability, allows for learning as you go, and doesn't try to fall back into the waterfall approach where everything's preset before you get started. We all know the principles behind it, but actually applying those principles into the little details, like the things that we were talking about today, is where people run into difficulty. What I do in the book is actually walk the reader through an initiative from start to finish and try to answer all of the questions that people have been asking me over the past many years about how to make this all happen.
As you say, it sounds to me that's very more focused on analysis than on development, and then I believe that's a really big gap.
Absolutely. It's entirely focused, in fact, on the analysis and the planning side of it. And the two are together because you can't separate them in Agile. You don't do all of your analysis and then based upon your knowledge of the requirements, plan the implementation. It's more that you discover the requirements as you go and you have to keep readjusting the plan. And so that's what I explained in the book.
That's really nice. Can we add a link beside this video to people who are interested in that?
The book is called The Agile Guide to Business Analysis and Planning, from Strategic Plan to Continuous Value Delivery. It's available on Amazon. It's published by Pearson Addison Wesley. It'll be available in hard copy and ebook, and it's coming out April 23rd, so very, very soon.
Oh,
and we're looking at, I would say, the major readers would be business analysts, product owners, and then leads, BA leads, and leads in, let's say, of a center, someone who's in charge of a center of excellence or is leading the center of excellence for business analysis or for agile practice. All of these people would be, readers of the intended readers for the book.
Yes, and me too.
Right. Yes.
Thank you very much, Howard. It was a great pleasure to see you. This, the Brazilian BA guests show, is the first episode, and then I believe we will have some others, and I would like to count on you for other questions that people may have. We will be even receiving questions that people want to ask. Please just add them in the comments of this video. This video is also available subtitled in Portuguese in the IIBA Brazil chapter channel on YouTube. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
A pleasure working with you also, Fabrizio, and I look forward to more conversations.
Bye-bye.